You don't like to go to your own films, do you?
No.
Yeah. Why is that?
It makes me feel unpleasant, you know.
We're selling tickets now. That's why that's why people don't watch this show. We make them feel unpleasant. I mean, are you self-conscious when you see your on the big screen?
I'd rather walk away with the experience of the process of making the film. Yeah. Once they give me the boot, it's really none of my business.
So you feel your responsibility is only in your craft, making the movie top to bottom, and that's it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's wise. I mean, really, beyond that, you've done your part.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. I'm done.
Now, what about your family? I bet they see your films.
I think they do, yeah.
Yeah.
My kids have I think my kids have actually seen more of my films than I have.
How old are your kids?
8 and 11 now.
8? Oh, 8 years old. Oh, 11. Yeah, boy.
Decades, fans have watched Johnny Depp compare to iconic roles. Yet there's a strange truth hiding in plain sight. He rarely watches his own films. Not once, not casually, not even after global premieres. It sounds unbelievable, but in multiple interviews, including conversations with BBC and independent outlets, he openly admitted this habit. Why would one of Hollywood's most celebrated actors avoid his own work? Is it fear, principle, or something deeper? The answer isn't simple, and once you understand it, it completely changes how you see his career, his craft, and the man behind the characters. There is something deeply unusual about the way Johnny Depp approaches his own work, and it goes against everything people expect from someone at his level. Most actors, especially those who reach global fame, study their performances, rewatch scenes, analyze what worked and what did not, and use that feedback to refine their craft. But Depp made a decision very early in his career that he would not do that. He has said clearly in interviews with BBC and other outlets that once his work is done, it no longer belongs to him. In his own words, the moment the film is finished, it becomes the audience's experience, not his. That idea might sound artistic, even poetic, but when you really think about it, it raises a serious question. How can someone improve, evolve, or even stay consistent if they refuse to look at what they have created? To understand this, you have to go back to the beginning of his career, long before the massive success of Pirates of the Caribbean or the global recognition he carries today. When Depp started out, he was not chasing mainstream success in the same way many actors do. He was drawn to characters that were strange, unconventional, sometimes even uncomfortable. Working with directors like Tim Burton shaped that mindset even further, because those films were less about perfection and more about expression. Depp has explained that he never wanted to see himself from the outside because it would make him self-conscious. Once an actor becomes aware of how they look, how they sound, how they are perceived, something changes. The performance becomes controlled instead of natural. He described this in a very direct way during interviews, saying that watching himself would feel like seeing a version of himself that is no longer real. For him, acting is about being completely present in the moment, losing himself in the character, and then letting it go. If he were to watch the final product, it would break that illusion. It would turn something emotional and instinctive into something technical and critical. And for Depp, that is exactly what he wants to avoid. He does not want to sit there judging his own facial expressions, his voice, or his choices, because that kind of thinking would follow him into the next role. This is where things start to get interesting, because this approach is not just rare, it is almost risky. Imagine creating something that millions of people will see, something that will define your legacy, and choosing not to experience it the way everyone else does. Most actors want control over their image, but Depp has done the opposite. He has given up the control entirely. He trusts the process, trusts the directors, and most importantly, trusts the audience. That level of detachment is not something you see often in Hollywood, where image and perception are everything. There is also a psychological layer to this that many people overlook. Actors often struggle with separating themselves from their roles. When you spend months becoming someone else, living inside the character's emotions, it can leave a mark. Watching the final film can bring all of that back, sometimes in ways that are uncomfortable or even overwhelming. Depp has hinted at this idea in interviews, explaining that once he finishes a role, he prefers to move forward rather than revisit it. It is not about ignoring his work, it is about protecting his mindset. And yet, despite never watching his own films, his performances remain some of the most recognizable in modern cinema. Think about Captain Jack Sparrow, a character that could have easily been a one-dimensional pirate stereotype, but instead became something completely unique. The slurred speech, the unpredictable movements, the balance between humor and mystery, all of it came from instinct rather than analysis. Depp did not build that character by studying himself on screen. He built it by experimenting in the moment, trusting his instincts, and letting the performance evolve naturally. What makes this even more surprising is that directors and co-stars have often praised his attention to detail. They describe him as someone who is deeply committed to every scene, someone who brings ideas that are unexpected but effective. So even without watching his own work, he is clearly aware of what he is doing. The difference is that his awareness exists during the performance, not after it. He is fully present when it matters, and then he lets it go completely. There is a story often mentioned in discussions about his career where he was asked directly if he had ever made an exception, if there was even one film he decided to watch. His answer remained consistent. He said no, and he explained that it was a choice he made early on and never felt the need to change. That consistency is important, because it shows this is not a random habit or a temporary phase. It is a core part of how he approaches his profession. At the same time, this decision has led to a lot of speculation. Some people believe it is a way of avoiding criticism, others think it is a sign of insecurity, and some see it as a form of artistic purity. The truth, based on his own words, seems to be much simpler. He does not see value in watching something that is already finished. For him, the creative process ends when filming ends. Everything after that is out of his hands. But here is where the story takes a deeper turn, because not watching his own films does not mean he is disconnected from them. In fact, in several interviews, he has spoken about how certain roles stayed with him long after filming was complete. Not visually, not in terms of how they looked on screen, but emotionally. He remembers how they felt, what they meant, and what he experienced while playing them. In a way, his connection to his work is internal rather than external. This creates a completely different relationship between the actor and the audience. While viewers remember scenes, lines, and visuals, Depp remembers moments, emotions, and instincts. It is almost like two different versions of the same story exist at the same time. One that the audience sees, and one that only he experienced during the process, and that raises a powerful idea that most people never consider. What if watching his own films would actually limit him instead of helping him? What if seeing himself on screen would create a fixed image in his mind, something he would start trying to repeat or avoid? By not watching, he stays free from that influence. Every new role becomes a fresh experience, untouched by past performances. This approach might sound unconventional, but it explains why his characters feel so different from each other. There is no sense of repetition, no feeling that he is relying on a formula. Each role stands on its own, shaped by the moment rather than by a calculated plan. And that is exactly where the story begins to reveal something even more unexpected about how he sees success, fame, and control over his own identity. And that perspective becomes even more clear when you look at how Johnny Depp talks about fame itself, because for him, fame was never the goal. It was more like a side effect that came with doing work he genuinely cared about. In multiple interviews, including conversations with BBC and press tours over the years, he has explained that the attention, the spotlight, and the constant public focus were things he never fully embraced. This matters because it connects directly to why he avoids watching his own films. If you are not interested in maintaining a perfect public image, then there is less reason to study yourself on screen and try to control how people see you. He once described the experience of seeing himself as uncomfortable, almost like looking at a stranger who happens to share his face. That feeling is not something most actors admit openly, because the industry often expects confidence, self-awareness, and control. But Depp's honesty about this creates a different narrative. Instead of trying to master how he appears, he focuses on the authenticity of the moment while performing. Once that moment is over, he moves forward without looking back. This mindset also explains why he has taken roles that many others would have avoided. Working again with Tim Burton on projects like Edward Scissorhands or Sleepy Hollow, he stepped into characters that were emotionally complex, visually unusual, and far from traditional leading man roles. Those choices were not made based on how they would look on screen after editing. They were made based on how they felt during the process. He trusted the directors and the story enough to let go of the need to evaluate himself afterward. There is also a pattern in how his co-stars describe working with him. Many of them mention that he rarely talks about his past performances. He does not sit around discussing scenes from previous films or comparing roles. Instead, he stays focused on the present project. That kind of discipline is rare in an industry where actors are often defined by their past successes. By not watching his own films, he avoids being influenced by them, which allows him to approach each new role without preconceived limits. Another layer to this is how he views mistakes. Most actors watch their performances to identify what they could have done better. They look for small details, moments where they feel they could have improved. Depp has taken a completely different approach. He accepts that imperfections are part of the performance. In interviews, he has hinted that trying to correct every flaw can actually remove the humanity from a character. Real people are not perfect, and neither should performances be. By not analyzing himself on screen, he preserves the natural unpredictability. This does not mean he is careless or unaware of his craft. On the contrary, directors have often spoken about his deep preparation and commitment before and during filming. The difference is that his process happens entirely in the moment. Once the scene is done, he trusts that what needed to happen has already happened. There is no need to revisit it, because the purpose of the performance was fulfilled during creation, not during playback. His approach becomes even more interesting when you consider the scale of some of his films. Pirates of the Caribbean became a global phenomenon, with massive audiences, huge budgets, and cultural impact that lasted for years. Most actors in the position would study their performance carefully, especially when returning for sequels. They would want to maintain consistency, refine what worked, and avoid repeating mistakes. But Depp did not change his method. He continued to rely on instinct. Even as the stakes grew higher in interviews during the Pirates press tours, he was asked about how he developed Captain Jack Sparrow, and his answers were always focused on inspiration rather than analysis. He talked about drawing from unexpected sources, experimenting with voice and movement, and finding the character through exploration rather than planning. That process would have been very different if he had been watching his own performance and trying to adjust it based on what he saw. Instead, each appearance of the character felt alive, slightly different, and unpredictable. There is also a deeper emotional reason behind his choice that becomes clear when you listen closely to how he describes his relationship with his work. He often speaks about letting go. Once a film is finished, he sees it as something that belongs to the audience. That idea might sound simple, but it reflects a very deliberate philosophy. By letting go, he avoids becoming attached to a specific image of himself. He does not chase perfection, and he does not try to control how his work is received. This creates a kind of freedom that is difficult to maintain in a highly competitive industry. When actors become too focused on their image, it can limit their choices. They start selecting roles based on how they will be perceived rather than how they feel about the character. Depp's decision to avoid watching his own films removes that pressure. He is not trying to protect a brand or maintain a specific persona. He is simply exploring characters at the same time. This approach has not been without challenges. There have been moments in his career where his choices were questioned, where certain performances received mixed reactions, and where the direction of his projects was debated publicly. Without watching his own work, he does not engage with that feedback in the same way other actors might. He does not analyze reviews or adjust his style based on criticism. Instead, he continues to follow his instincts, even when the response is uncertain. This consistency is what makes his career so unique. While many actors evolve by studying their past work, Depp evolves by focusing entirely on the present. Each role becomes an independent experience, shaped by the script, the director, and the moment rather than by a calculated effort to improve on what came before. It is a different kind of growth, one that is less about correction and more about exploration. There is also an important detail that often gets overlooked. Even though he does not watch his own films, he is not disconnected from the audience. He understands how people respond to his characters, not by seeing them on screen, but by observing reactions, conversations, and the cultural impact of his work. He knows which characters resonate, which moments become iconic, and which performances leave a lasting impression. But instead of studying those moments visually, he processes them conceptually. This creates an interesting balance between awareness and attachment. He is aware of his impact, but detached from the visual representation of it. That balance allows him to stay grounded while still being part of something much larger than himself. It also explains why his performances often feel genuine rather than calculated. There is no sense that he is trying to recreate a previous success or live up to a specific expectation, and then there is the question that always comes up when people hear about this habit. Has he really never watched even a single full film of his own? According to his own statements in interviews over the years, the answer remains consistent. He may have seen small clips during production or editing discussions, but he has never sat down to watch his films from beginning to end. That distinction is important because it shows that his decision is not about avoiding the process entirely, but about avoiding the final experience. As a viewer, this idea might seem extreme, but it highlights something that most people never think about. The experience of creating something is completely different from the experience of consuming it. For Depp, the creation is what matters. The emotions, the collaboration, the energy on set, all of that is where the meaning exists for him. The final product, while important to the audience, is not where he finds value, and as his career continued, this philosophy did not fade, it became even more defined. Even as new generations discovered his work, even as his films reached wider audiences through streaming and global releases, he remained consistent in his approach. He did not suddenly decide to revisit his performances or analyze his past roles. Instead, he stayed committed to the same principle he established at the beginning. But what makes this story even more compelling is not just the fact that he avoids watching his own films, it is the reason behind it, and how that reason connects to something much bigger than acting. Because when you look closely, this is not just about movies, it is about identity, control, and the choice to separate who you are from what you create. And that is where the story begins to reveal an even deeper truth about how he protects himself from becoming trapped by his own image. That idea of separating identity from image is where everything starts to connect on a deeper level. Because for Johnny Depp, the decision to never fully watch his own films is not just about acting, it is about maintaining a boundary between who he is and what the world thinks he is. In several interviews over the years, including conversations with outlets like BBC and Rolling Stone, he has explained that the moment a performance is captured on film, it becomes something fixed, something that no longer changes. But as a person, he does not want to feel fixed. He does not want to look at a version of himself that is locked in time and start comparing it to who he is now. This is especially important when you consider how long his career has lasted and how many different versions of himself exist on screen. From the early days of films like What's Eating Gilbert Grape to the massive global success of Pirates of the Caribbean, each role represents a different phase of his life, a different mindset, a different emotional state. Watching those performances back would not just be about analyzing acting choices, it would be about revisiting moments of his own life that he may have already moved on from. And for someone who values moving forward, that kind of reflection can feel unnecessary or even uncomfortable. He has hinted at this in interviews when he talks about the idea of letting things go. Once a project is finished, he does not carry it with him in a visual sense. He carries the experience, the memory of what it felt like, but not the image of how it looked. That distinction is important because it shows that his connection to his work is emotional rather than visual. He remembers the process, not the product. This also explains why his performances often feel so instinctive. When an actor watches themselves repeatedly, they can become aware of patterns in their behavior. They might notice certain expressions, certain tones, certain habits, and then either try to repeat them or avoid them. Over time, this can create a kind of formula, a predictable style that audiences start to recognize. But Depp avoids that entirely. Because he does not watch himself, he does not build those patterns in the same way. Each performance is shaped in the moment, without the influence of past visuals. Directors who have worked with him have often pointed out that he brings a sense of unpredictability to his roles. They describe him as someone who is willing to take risks, to try something unexpected, even if it might not work perfectly. That willingness comes from the fact that he is not thinking about how it will look later. He is focused entirely on how it feels in that moment. And that is a rare quality, especially in an industry where so much emphasis is placed on the final image. There is also a practical side to this decision that people sometimes overlook. Filming a movie is an intense process. It can take months of long hours, emotional scenes, and constant repetition. By the time a project is finished, many actors feel exhausted, both physically and mentally. Watching the final film can sometimes feel like reliving that entire process all over again. For Depp, choosing not to watch is a way of closing the chapter completely. It allows him to move on to the next project without carrying the weight of the previous one. This approach becomes even more significant when you consider the level of public attention he has experienced. Being constantly in the spotlight means that every performance, every role, every appearance is analyzed and discussed by millions of people. If he were to watch his own films, he would not just be seeing his performance, he would also be seeing the version of himself that the world has formed opinions about. By avoiding that, he creates a kind of distance between his personal identity and his public image. In a BBC interview, he explained that he has no interest in watching himself because it would not change anything. The work is already done, the film is already released, and the audience has already formed their opinions. For him, there is no benefit in going back and analyzing something that cannot be changed. Instead, he prefers to focus on what he can control, which is the next role, the next performance, the next creative experience. This mindset also challenges a common belief about success in creative fields. Many people assume that improvement comes from constant analysis, from reviewing past work and identifying areas for growth. But Depp's career suggests that there is another path, one that relies on intuition, presence, and trust in the creative process. Instead of looking backward, he looks forward, allowing each new project to be a fresh start. There have been moments where this approach was questioned, especially during times when his career faced challenges or when certain projects received mixed reactions. Critics and audiences sometimes wondered whether his refusal to watch his own work might limit his ability to adapt or evolve. But despite those questions, he remained consistent. He did not change his process, and he did not start analyzing his performances in response to criticism. He continued to rely on the same principles that guided him from the beginning. This consistency is what makes his story so compelling. In an industry that constantly pushes for control, perfection, and self-awareness, he chose a path that prioritizes freedom, instinct, and detachment. And while that path may not work for everyone, it has clearly worked for him in a way that is both unique and enduring. Another interesting detail is how this philosophy affects the way audiences experience his performances. Because he is not trying to shape his image based on past roles, his characters often feel more authentic and less predictable. There is a sense that anything could happen, that the performance is unfolding naturally rather than following a set pattern. That unpredictability is part of what makes his work so memorable. At the same time, it also creates a certain mystery around him as an actor. Most performers are very aware of how they are perceived, and they often talk about their roles in terms of technique and analysis. Depp, on the other hand, speaks more about feeling, instinct, and experience. He does not break down his performances in technical terms, and he does not reference specific moments from his films in the way many actors do. This adds to the idea that his connection to his work exists on a different level, and when you step back and look at the bigger picture, it becomes clear that this is not just a habit or a personal preference, it is a deliberate philosophy. It is a way of protecting his creativity, maintaining his sense of self, and avoiding the pressure of living up to a fixed image. By not watching his own films, he keeps his relationship with his work fluid, open, and constantly evolving. This philosophy also extends beyond acting into how he views life in general. In interviews, he has often spoken about the importance of staying curious, of not becoming trapped by expectations, and of continuing to explore new ideas. That same mindset is reflected in his approach to his career. He does not want to be defined by what he has already done, and he does not want to limit himself by constantly revisiting the past. And this is where the truth behind the original claim becomes clear in a way that most people do not expect. The fact that he has never truly sat down to watch his own films is not a sign of disinterest, insecurity, or avoidance. It is a conscious decision rooted in a deeper understanding of creativity, identity, and the difference between creating something and observing it. Because in his world, the moment you start observing yourself too closely, you risk losing the very thing that made your work unique in the first place. You start to perform for the camera instead of living in the moment. You start to think about how something will look instead of how it feels. And once that shift happens, the authenticity begins to fade. So instead of looking back, he keeps moving forward, trusting that what he creates in the moment is enough, and leaving the rest to the audience. And the choice, as unusual as it may seem, is exactly what has allowed him to build a career that feels both unpredictable and deeply personal at the same time. And when you really follow that idea to its core, it starts to explain not just his choices as an actor, but the way he has managed to survive in an industry that often reshapes people into predictable versions of themselves. For Johnny Depp, the refusal to watch his own films becomes a kind of shield, something that protects him from becoming overly aware of how he is seen. Because once that awareness takes over, it can slowly start to control decisions, influence performances, and even limit creativity in ways that are not always obvious at first. He has spoken in interviews about how easy it is for actors to fall into patterns, especially after a role becomes successful. When something works, there is a natural pressure to repeat it, to give audiences more of what they already like. But that repetition can slowly turn into a trap. Instead of exploring new ideas, the actor begins to recreate old ones. By not watching his own work, he removes one of the main sources of that pressure. He is not studying what worked in the past, so he is not tempted to copy it in the future. This is particularly important when you think about characters like Captain Jack Sparrow. That role became so iconic that it could have easily defined his entire career. Many actors in that situation would lean into that success, trying to recreate the same energy in different roles or even within sequels. But Depp approached it differently. Each time he returned to the character, he relied on instinct rather than imitation. He did not watch previous performances to match them exactly. Instead, he allowed the character to evolve naturally, which is why each appearance feels slightly different. Even within the same franchise, there is also something very human about his decision when you look at it from a psychological perspective. Watching yourself on screen is not always a comfortable experience. It can create a sense of distance between who you are and how you appear. Small details become magnified, expressions feel unfamiliar, and moments that felt natural during filming can look completely different afterward. For some people, that experience is useful. For others, it can be distracting or even unsettling. Depp has been very clear about which side he falls on in a number of interviews. He has described the idea of seeing himself as something he does not relate to. Not in a dramatic way, but in a very honest and straightforward sense. The person on screen is a version of him, but it is also shaped by editing, lighting, direction, and countless other factors. It is not the same as the experience he had while performing. So instead of trying to connect those two versions, he simply chooses not to engage with the final image at all. This creates a kind of separation that allows him to stay grounded. He is not constantly comparing himself to a polished, edited version of his work. He is not analyzing how he looks or how he sounds. He is focused on the process rather than the outcome. And that focus is what keeps his performances feeling authentic, even after decades in the industry. Another important detail is how this approach affects his relationship with success and failure. When actors watch their own films, they often tie their sense of achievement to how the performance looks on screen or how it is received by audiences. Positive reactions can boost confidence, while negative reactions can lead to self-doubt. By not watching his own work, Depp removes that direct connection. He is aware of how his films perform, but he does not experience them in the same way as the audience, which creates a buffer between his personal sense of self and the public response. This does not mean he ignores feedback completely. He understands the impact of his work and listens to the people he collaborates with. But he does not internalize that feedback through repeated viewing of his own performances. Instead, he processes it in a more abstract way, focusing on the overall experience rather than specific visual details. His collaborators have often mentioned that he is deeply engaged during filming, constantly experimenting and refining his approach in real time. That is where his attention is fully focused. Once the scene is complete, he trusts that the work has been done. There is no need to revisit it, because the purpose of the performance was to exist in that moment, not to be analyzed afterward. This way of thinking also challenges the idea that control is always necessary for success. In many industries, especially in entertainment, there is a strong emphasis on managing every detail, from performance to public image. But Depp's career shows that letting go can sometimes be just as powerful as holding on. By giving up control over how he appears on screen, he gains control over how he experiences his work, and that shift in perspective is what makes his approach so different. Instead of trying to perfect an image, he focuses on creating something real in the moment. Instead of analyzing the past, he invests his energy in the present. Instead of shaping his identity around his performances, He allows his performances to exist independently of his identity. There is also a quiet confidence in that decision. It takes a certain level of trust to walk away from your own work and never look back at it. Trust in your ability, trust in the people you work with, and trust in the audience to experience it in their own way. Not every actor would be comfortable with that level of detachment, but for him, it seems to be exactly what allows him to keep moving forward without being weighed down by expectations. And as his career continues to be discussed, analyzed, and revisited by audiences around the world, that one simple fact remains unchanged. He still does not sit down and watch his own films from start to finish. Not because he cannot, not because he is avoiding something, but because he made a choice a long time ago about how he wants to experience his work, a choice that separates him from the very thing that made him famous, and at the same time, might be the exact reason why his performances continue to feel so original, so unpredictable, and so completely his own. And when you look at the choice over the full span of his career, it starts to feel less like a strange habit and more like a carefully protected principle that has shaped everything he does. For Johnny Depp, this is not about rejecting his work. It is about refusing to let his work define him in a way that limits his freedom. Because once an actor begins to see themselves through the lens of their past performances, it can quietly start to influence every decision they make going forward. He has explained in different interviews that the danger is not in watching a film once, but in what comes after. The mind starts to replay moments, compare choices, and build a kind of internal checklist of what worked and what did not. Over time, that checklist can turn into a set of rules, and those rules can slowly replace instinct. Instead of responding naturally to a character, the actor begins to think about how similar moments were handled before. That shift is subtle, but it can change the entire feeling of a performance. By choosing not to watch his own films, he avoids creating that internal rulebook. Every role begins without the weight of previous ones. There is no visual reference point to match or avoid. There is only the script, the character, and the moment. And that is what keeps his work feeling alive rather than rehearsed. This idea becomes even more meaningful when you consider how much of acting depends on vulnerability. To fully step into a role, an actor has to let go of self-consciousness, at least to some extent. They have to be willing to look unusual, to take risks, and to explore emotions that are not always comfortable. If they are constantly aware of how they might look on screen later, that vulnerability can be reduced. Hesitation can replace spontaneity. Depp has often been described by directors and co-stars as someone who commits completely to the moment, even if it means trying something unexpected. That kind of commitment is easier to maintain when you are not thinking about how it will appear from the outside. Because the moment you start imagining the final image, you are no longer fully inside the experience. You are observing it at the same time. There is also a deeper emotional aspect to this that becomes clearer the more you think about it. Films are not created in isolation. They are connected to specific times, places, and experiences in an actor's life. Watching them later can bring all of that back, not just the performance, but everything surrounding it. For someone who prefers to keep moving forward, that kind of reflection can feel unnecessary or even heavy. In interviews, he has hinted at the idea that once something is done, it should be left where it belongs. Not ignored, but not revisited in a way that keeps it active in the present. This does not mean he does not value his past work. It means he values it enough to let it stand on its own, without constantly returning to it. This perspective also changes the way success is measured. Instead of judging a performance based on how it looks after editing, he measures it based on the experience of creating it. Did it feel real in the moment? Did it connect with the people involved? Did it bring something new to the character? Those are the questions that matter to him, not how the final image compares to others. And the difference in perspective is what allows him to take risks that others might avoid. When you are not focused on protecting an image, you are more willing to step into roles that are unusual, unpredictable, or even controversial. You are not trying to maintain consistency in how you appear. You are exploring what is possible within each character. This is why his filmography feels so varied. There is no single pattern that defines his work. No clear formula that repeats across roles. Each performance exists in its own space, shaped by its own set of choices. And the variety is not the result of careful planning based on past analysis. It is the result of staying present and allowing each project to develop on its own terms. At the same time, his decision has created a kind of mystery that continues to surround him. Audiences and critics often analyze his performances in great detail, breaking down specific scenes, discussing choices, and comparing roles. But he does not participate in the process in the same way. He does not revisit those moments visually, and he does not build his understanding of his own work through repeated viewing. This creates an interesting contrast between how his work is experienced by others and how it is experienced by him. For the audience, the films are the final product, something to be watched, rewatched, and analyzed. For him, the films are the result of a process that has already passed. The meaning exists in what happened during creation, not in what is seen afterward, and yet, despite the distance, his connection to his work is still very real. He remembers the feeling of each role, the energy of each set, the collaboration with directors and actors. Those memories are not tied to images, they are tied to experiences. And in many ways, that connection is more personal than simply watching a finished film. There is also a quiet discipline in maintaining this approach over so many years. It would be easy to break that rule, to give in to curiosity and watch at least one film from start to finish. But he has remained consistent, which suggests that this is not just a casual preference, it is something he actively chooses to uphold. That consistency has become part of what defines him, not just as an actor, but as a creative person. It reflects a broader belief in staying true to the process rather than becoming attached to the result. And in an industry where results are often everything, that belief stands out. It also raises a question that goes beyond acting. How much of what we create should we hold on to, and how much should we let go? At what point does reflection become limitation? These are not questions with simple answers, but his approach offers one possible perspective. By letting go of the need to constantly look back, he keeps his focus on what comes next, and that forward focus is what continues to drive his work. Even after decades in the industry, he approaches new roles with the same sense of curiosity and openness that he had at the beginning. There is no sense of trying to recreate a past version of himself, no attempt to match previous successes. There is only the next character, the next story, the next moment to explore. So when people hear that he has never truly watched his own films, it might sound surprising at first, even difficult to understand. But when you follow the reasoning behind it, it starts to make sense in a way that goes far beyond a single habit. It becomes a reflection of how he sees creativity, identity, and the balance between the two. Because in the end, the most unexpected part of this story is not that he avoids watching his own work, it is that by doing so, he may have found a way to protect the very thing that made him successful in the first place: the ability to stay present, to take risks, and to create without being held back by the image of what has already been done. And when you carry that idea all the way to the end, it reveals something that most people never notice about how a career like this is sustained over decades without losing its edge. For Johnny Depp, the refusal to watch his own films is not just about avoiding discomfort or staying different. It becomes a long-term strategy for survival in an environment that constantly tries to define and repeat what works. Because once an actor becomes a fixed image in the audience's mind, the industry often starts building around that image, offering similar roles, expecting similar performances, and slowly narrowing the space for experimentation. He has talked about this pressure in different ways across interviews, explaining that repetition can quietly become the default path if you are not careful. When something succeeds on a massive level, there is a system that naturally tries to reproduce that success. Producers want familiarity, studios want reliability, and audiences often expect to see what they already love. In that environment, it becomes very easy for an actor to fall into a pattern without even realizing it, but his decision creates a barrier against that pattern. By not watching his own performances, he does not build a visual reference of what success looked like before. There is no mental replay of scenes that worked, no detailed memory of expressions or timing that can be copied. Instead, each new role is approached as if nothing has been proven yet. That mindset keeps the creative process open, even when external expectations are high. This is also why his performances often carry a sense of risk that feels genuine rather than calculated. When you watch his work, there are moments that feel spontaneous, almost as if they were discovered in real time rather than carefully constructed. That quality is difficult to maintain if an actor is constantly reviewing and refining their past performances. Analysis can bring precision, but it can also reduce unpredictability. By stepping away from that analysis, he preserves a certain rawness in his work. There is another layer to this that connects directly to how he experiences his own identity. When people watch his films, they often associate him with the characters he plays. Those images become part of how he is perceived in the world. But if he were to watch those same films repeatedly, he might start to see himself through that same lens. The boundary between the person and the performance could become less clear by choosing not to watch. He maintains that boundary. He knows the characters he has played, but he does not internalize the visual representation of them in the same way. He remembers the process, not the image. And that allows him to keep his sense of self separate from the roles that made him famous. This separation becomes even more important when you consider how intense public attention can be. Over the years, his life and career have been discussed, analyzed, and sometimes misunderstood on a global scale. In that kind of environment, it would be very easy to become overly focused on how you are seen. Watching your own films could amplify that awareness, making it harder to stay grounded instead. He keeps his focus on the parts of the process that are within his control. The preparation, the collaboration, the performance itself. Everything that comes after, including how the film is edited, received, and remembered, is something he allows to exist independently. That level of detachment is not about indifference. It is about protecting the space where creativity happens. There is also something quietly disciplined about staying committed to this approach for so long. Curiosity alone could easily break it. The desire to see how a scene turned out, to experience a film the way the audience does, to revisit a performance years later. But he has consistently chosen not to do that. And that consistency suggests that the value he finds in not watching is greater than any curiosity he might have about the final result. In interviews, he has occasionally acknowledged that this choice might seem unusual to others, but for him, it feels natural. He does not see a reason to change something that has worked for him creatively.